Hi there, and welcome on the journey to transform culture. I'm Steve, and I'll be your guide. Well, folks, I hope you're having a fantastic day and an even better week. Well, folks, it's still winter time currently. I don't know when you're watching this video, but I got wood in the stove and semi bundled up here, and yeah, so we're gonna do the thing. But so this week, I'll get to the title of the video in a second, but I just kind of want to remind you that remember, on the journey to transform culture, use any insights to better your life personally and professionally in a healthy way. Naturally, if you need to consult counselor, doctor, all of the ers, do so. Right? You seek the level of counseling and or uh, mentoring that you require. This is a conversation between friends and colleagues, but hopefully we can kind of, as we kind of talk about some of these things, maybe it'll open a door, right? A door for you to understand yourself or understand others or understand teams. If you're an organization, understand your people, right? When I say your people, they're not your people, but you know what I'm saying, your team. To understand yourself, right, as an organizational leader and understand, I guess you could say, all of culture, right, and cultures, right, because we ultimately want better and thriving lives, ultimately, but there are a lot of, it's a journey, right, and along this journey, we really just have each other. So this loosely, this title is going to be Everything You Need to Know, Part 1. Okay. Part one. And I say part one, but it could be, it might be that I can get it all into one video. I just don't want it to be so long. So if I need to break it up into a couple chunks, I will. But there are facets to it. And I'm compiling this in such a way that hopefully, yes, think of it like a breakfast, right? A Saturday morning breakfast when you've got all the goodies on there, right? I'm trying to make sure that I've got all the individual uh, food groups, right, represented within the breakfast. Okay, so, and if you've never watched my videos before, yeah, I do like food. Naturally, we all like food, hopefully. But anyway, so while I try to bring you a nice hearty breakfast, um, enjoy it, have fun with it, and hopefully we can have some fun making this video for you, and so that you can, so we can glean more about ourselves. Right? It's always a discovery. It's always an adventure. Right? I always think about if you've ever gone for a hike or for a drive, and maybe you're on a little off road. It doesn't have to be massively off road, but maybe you're on a dirt road or a trail or something, and you're like, well, I don't think this goes anywhere. Well, we'll go just a little further. I think there's, well, I think, no, we probably need to turn around. No, just a little further. Because you're thinking that just up around the bend, there's going to be a cool waterfall, right? So that should be our approach, right, to life. And the adventure of it is, hey, let's not turn back now, right? There's probably some really cool views and a really awesome waterfall to play in just up around the corner. And if you got little ones or, they want to play in the waterfall. So let's play in the waterfall of life, folks, and let's have fun with it. So anyway, without further ado, and this isn't going to work because I have my gloves on, but I'm going to meet you over at the big board. And we're back. All right, folks. So let's get started. This essentially is, even though I may have coined this everything you need to know, and we'll see if we can get it into potentially one video. Human being, it's us, right? And remember, with all these things, it's connecting the dots, right? Personally, professionally, socially, all of it, right? Internally, externally, all of it. So without further ado, let's get started on this journey of this human being, right? All right. So before you arrived, there was a history that existed, right? And I'm going to use your to use like a sports analogy, essentially, your draft team, the team that drafted you, your family, your draft team, they had a history within culture before you, within in culture before you, right? Their individual progression, the family, if you had siblings. And remember, we all come from various backgrounds, right? So remember, with all of this, there's a range from the extremes of all sorts, right? To, varying degrees of mix, right? There's variability. But we'll try to get started and see where this takes us, right? But so there's a history before you got here, right? And that history was developed, right? Your parents or those who took care of you, right? Your broader family or those who you lived with, whatever the situation may be for you. There was essentially standards that were kind of set, right? I would say standards or a way of being at the very least, right? There was a way of being, right? And some of these things, we can always look back with hindsight being 2020 and go, some things were acceptable and some things were less acceptable, right? It just depends on what the norms were, right? For your draft team, right? So there's this history, and this was well ongoing before you arrived, right? Because we're talking about broader families too, and broader associations within the friends and community and all these things, right? And now it depends. Some people had very few and some had more, right? So again, variability. But there was a history, was a history, right? And that history was ongoing. Okay, so in the way of being that they had. Okay, we don't need to beat that one up too much more. And like it or not, a way of being existed. And then here you came. All right, you came into the picture, and you came into these conditions. These conditions existed before you got here, right? Because remember, there was a history before you. And now you're arriving into those conditions now. Now, those conditions, it could have been one of lack, right? Could have been enough, or it could have been a lot. Now, when I write that, when it's lack, enough, or a lot, it's easy for our brain to firewall to money, right? And I'm not excluding money, that's significant, but lack, enough, or a lot could be multiple or many things, okay? It can be money, right? Monetarily, could have not a whole lot of money, right? Could have been poor, very poor. Could have had a mix, right? Where, good days, bad days, but essentially there was, you did okay. And then a lot, right? And now these things aren't insignificant, right? Especially, well, not just especially, but for all areas. But this could also be the time and attention, right? Time and attention is significant here. So we're going to put time, attention. All right, so we get time and attention. I know it's a little messy in there. That's okay. It's going to get busier, trust me. So you got time and attention in there. So, and what is that? That really is tending to your emotions, right? If you're a young kid, right? Very, very, very young. Time and attention is significant, right? This is how you're tended to. The love, the emotions, the care, your feelings about things. Of course, you're little, so you're bouncing off the walls, right? But the time and attention are super important, right? But also physical environment, right? What kind of environment? Because that environment could have been lacking too. Could have been very difficult environment, right? Could have been okay, right? And it could have been an amazing environment, right? And by environment, that could be anything from the home or the neighborhood you grew up in, or if you were out on a farm, or all the things, right? It could be a myriad of, we couldn't cover all the areas, but you get the idea. There's variation here, right? And so the conditions you came into, you were born into, were an interesting mix of foundational influences, right? And that essentially created an imprint, okay? Hopefully you can see this. An imprint, okay? This created an imprint on you, on your psyche, right? On who you were as a very little person coming into the world. And in the very beginning of things, this imprint is really, the beginnings of conditioning, right? The imprint really is conditioning because it's saying, oh, this is normal, right? There's a normalization, right? I'm going to write it here. I'm just going to put norm and not like from Cheers. Okay. So there's creating norms. There's a normalization, right? And that creates an imprint, okay? And remember, all of that is derived from what? The history that existed before you got there, got here, okay? Before you arrived at this wonderful planet Earth, right? Before you buzzed on in. So that's, these are the beginnings of a foundational imprint, right, on you. And then as you're growing, of course, you're exploring your environment a little bit. You're say a young kid and you're getting a little bit older, past the first year or two, and you're starting to explore your environment, right? Your yard, maybe the two closest neighbors on your little buddies, the things of that nature. You're exploring your environment, right? And you're basically beginning to form at the very early stage judgment. You're starting to form some judgments, right? This is good, this isn't good. That neighbor has a mean dog, that neighbor has a mean dog and their kids are mean, whatever. All the things. You're starting to see where there's variability. You're starting to pick up on this variability. You're accepting of pretty much what you arrived into, right? But you're starting to explore your environment, and you're starting to now you're starting to make some judgments, right, about those things. The other thing you're also starting to do is, because of, we'll say our parents and the people in our close circle, right, are significant influencers when we're young, right? Could have been anybody. It could be your grandparents, could be your parents, whoever you particularly had. But you're forming judgments, but you're also we're beginning to also make a judgment, and it's really about an accepting. Flip over to the permo marker here. Starting to accept or reject, right? Don't like to go down there. The dog is mean, right? Those people, not so nice. Oh, those people, hey, they, they bring over baked goods and brownies and whatever. Oh, like them, right? And when we're young, we're very influenced, right? That imprint and that conditioning now can also be, internally biased too, right? So we can be biased as young kids. We can be like, ooh, yeah, they bring me a toy, or they bring me, treats, and oh, I like that, and that sort of thing. And so as young kids, obviously our parents have to kind of put guardrails in, right, and teach us that to start to kind of resist this, right? But that being said, we were kids, right? And that's just what it is. So, but we're making judgments, but we're also accepting or rejecting, right or wrong. We're accepting or rejecting, and some of it is a little bit from that base level imprint, right? But as we go, the world starts to get a little bit broader for us, right? And so the other thing we're also starting to flip into is bias. As we're exploring our environment, not only are we accepting and rejecting, but we're also starting to bring all this together, mirror it off of our small environment at this point, and we're starting to see bias now, right? We're starting to see the bias. And that bias isn't just in our, small environment as we're getting older, but it's also about those people who drafted us too, right? Drafted us onto their team. We're starting to make some and we're starting to accept and reject some of those things. This is the beginning of, um, starting to, you could say, the healthy word is discern, but we're really making judgments, right? Even quietly, even to ourselves, going, don't really like that, or whatever. And some of those can be healthy things, and some of the things, or I should say, obviously, we're going to be biased away from things that aren't good for us, and hopefully biased toward things that are good for us, unless we're talking about the treats and all that thing. Then we're anything, kids. There's anything goes. I have grandkids, so yeah. Anyway, but we're starting to make judgments, and we're starting to see a bit of a bias, and we're starting to pick up on the bias of what was going on down here, and I hate to be, this is where all the isms come in, right? So, God forbid, if there was addiction, if there was, all the isms you can think of, okay? Now, I can pick an easy one to make this real simple: racism. The isms, racism is one that's easy to delineate because it's pretty overt. As our circle and our environment starts to expand and we start to see a little bit more, we're starting to pick up on the fact that an imprint or a bias inherent to our draft team, right, might have included some of these isms, right? If there was a lot of alcohol or a lot of drugs or a lot of manipulative behavior, or all, just insert isms here, okay? We're starting to see, and especially if it's distasteful, right? As a kid, hopefully, a kid is going to pick up on and be very affected by the negative aspects of any ism, to be honest with you, okay? Even any ism where there's a hate, right? Where there's a hate involved. Hate is not a good thing, right? Especially if it's if we're making social judgments, right? You see this with extreme political spectrum, right? And all of those sorts of things too, where an opinion about a policy or a fact or an approach, an intellectual conversation turns into hey, there's a hate toward a particular group, right? Or any ism, okay? So we're starting to see beginnings of this, and we're starting at the very beginning to see how there's a bias here, right? And we're picking up on this in whiffs. And then once we see that, then we're starting to go, And so that becomes we kind of put that in the sandbox of our mind or our heart, right? And we may even sense that, hey, I live in a dangerous environment, right? You may be assessing, even as a young child, this environment, whether it be the people or the physical environment or all the things. It may be dangerous, maybe unhealthy, maybe all the, pick a negative thing, right? We may be picking up on all of those things, and we are likely picking up on those things. But we're also somewhat captive to it. Because why? We signed on to a contract with with our draft team, right? And so we don't know, we're still figuring, we don't at this point really understand that we turn 18 and we can, in America anyway, and now, hey, I can, go start my own team. We don't, or be my own team. We don't know all this yet. We don't know. We could be on, this could be a forever scenario as far as we know as young people. We don't know where this road is going, right? This adventure, right? Our journey to transform, it's just, we don't even, we're got the in journey. We haven't got further than that. So anyway, so there's that. So we're making judgments, we're picking up on bias, but then we go to school, right? We go to school, and this continues. We start to expand our picture now, because now, even though I put relationships up here, relationships are a part of all of this. So little r, but we're starting to form, little friendships, bonds at school. Maybe playing on little teams and doing our thing, right? Football, soccer, all the things, right? Baseball, all this stuff. And we may be doing that at school or after school or whatever. Community, some of that is community, little c community, but we're starting to learn, more importantly, we're starting to learn about systems of order now, right? And even though we're in, say, a classroom, right, a controlled environment, even if you're homeschooled, it's still the same. You're learning about systems of order, and we're getting a little bit of socialization, right, where we're learning how to negotiate and with our peers, right, somewhat for survival, maybe if it was an austere environment, and so on. So we're learning order now. As we go, remember before I talked about the judgment? Well, now we might go to a friend's house or something like that and go to their, all the things of that nature. Well, now we're starting to reflect even more, right? We're starting to see bias even more now within, not only within our draft team, okay? Not only are we seeing, oh, okay, I'm starting, the picture that is as we go, the picture becomes ever clearer about your draft team, more so than anything else, based on what you see in culture. Now, remember I said accept or reject? The two paths this takes is, if you accept the bias, now let's just use hate. Let's say that your draft team hates a particular group. I'm just picking something simple that we know goes on. They hate a particular group, okay? And you accept that, then as you go, some would say, oh, you're just being loyal to your draft team. No, not necessarily. You may have accepted it. There may be a little Stockholm syndrome going on here, right? As we were growing up, identify with our captors to a certain level, but you may understand the argument, but you haven't really gotten to a place where you can, you have enough data to make the case, right? You're not armed well enough at this early stage, right? So you accept it as just a placeholder. Okay, I guess I accept it, whatever. I don't have to run around and be that. But as you go, you get more data points, especially as you learn systems of order and being just, right? And fairness. Things that we're expected to be when we go out into the world, right? Follow the rules, driving, between the lines type thing, and, just basic fundamental rules of the social contract. You start to learn these things, and what ends up happening is you may come to reject, right? Even if it's quietly rejecting, right? It's like, well, I love, my draft team, but, I love them because, hey, they put up with me when I was a little knucklehead and whatever. But I reject their arguments and their philosophies, right, on certain things, because I'm not down with all the things, right? So, irrespective, you are doing this, whether you are or you aren't. And some folks will go their entire life accepting and fully buying into whatever ism. Now, let's say I'm going to use alcoholism, a behavior more so than a judgment, say, toward a group. If the way of being was that alcohol was just, oh yeah, we just constantly entrenched in that, right? You may accept that, and that now becomes a way of being for you, okay? At a certain place in your life, it may become problematic, right? And or the data points come in, right? Scared straight, right? Situations happen, sadly, right? And you learn, and boom, you make an adjustment, right? and you reject certain things. You go for a balanced, healthy lifestyle, or eliminate the ism, that particular ism, right? Completely. You basically reform yourself. But this isn't necessarily just negative habits and stuff, although it is. It can also be environment. It can also be an accepted, because you can also be guilted, right? So let's say, so guilt. So if you, as you're going along, let's say you reject something and you're, you're an outspoken young person, you may reject, behaviors, right? Or environments. And you may be on a trajectory that starts to break away from your draft team, right? And as you do that, what do you think happens? Well, now they're going to accept or reject you. And this is one of the hardest things, especially if you're young, to accept, right? And so what do you think happens? A guilt. Well, you must, you think you're better than we are. This is where this comes from. This isn't just your draft team, right? This could also be your friend groups, the local community, and all the things. But the guilt, you think you're better than we are. How dare you? It's the crabs in the bucket. If you don't know what that is, Google crabs in a bucket, okay? And you'll be like, what? If you don't know it, already know what it is. So essentially, this can happen, and it can happen with your friends. This can happen. This is where peer pressure, right? The whole idea of peer pressure, maybe a little bullying in there, right? The peer pressure happens, by your draft team just as much as it does as you're socialized into, systems of order, right? Because there is the playground, right? Playground politics, video I did on that. So anyway, you're learning about order, and you're starting to see the biases, but your world is expanding. And so now, not only is it the local stuff and the internal, say, your draft team and your local, your friends and that sort of thing, but now you're starting to get out more. You're starting to see more about, oh, this is what's going on in the world. And this is, you're getting the fundamentals of, say, history, fundamentals of where you live in the state and the country and all that, right? So you're getting that. So at least intellectually, your mind is starting to go, whoa, there's a lot more going on here than I realized. And this is way more complex, right? Well, so it would seem, right, to us, to our young brain. And so as those systems of order start to go in, now you may start, and you probably are, starting to see where the bias not only was in your draft team, but also, in your small circle, right? Your small circle. And as you formed through the younger years, right? So you may be 5, 6, 7, somewhere in here. And now you're starting to see how the world is more so. You're starting to get a feel for your community, right? Even though we haven't quite got there yet. And you're starting to go, oh, right? So you're collecting a lot more data. And along this journey to this point, everything has been challenge and response. Oops. Challenge and response. The only choices that you're really given at this point are based on challenge and response. Do you accept or reject, right? Are you going to accept the guilting, Are you going to accept the ways of being of others that you don't align with, say? Are you going to accept or reject, right? It's a challenge and a response. It is this as we're growing. And then as we go, the choice that we often find ourselves in is always a double track of challenge and response. And so we're responding to our environment, okay? To our environment. And then as we start to learn more about our community, because we're getting a picture of order, systems of order, we're starting to get out in the community. You might go out and go on a field trip and all the different things. And you're starting to, family trips, and you're getting a little bit older now and all of that as you're going through school, and you're starting to get the picture of community is growing even more. And so it's filling in with a lot of details, right? Your mirror back toward all of this is now becoming clearer and clearer and clearer with every day, week, and month and year that passes as you develop. And you are able to, accept or reject pretty easily. You may start to reject and feel manipulation and reject guilt and manipulation and so forth. If you accept it, this is where it gets dangerous. I'm not going to get into the details of introvert and extrovert here, but typically introvert is not going to rub people the wrong way. They kind of just want to be left to do their own thing. An extrovert's going to speak up and speak their mind. And usually, they're going to put up a fuss. When we're younger, for sure, right? They're going to be outspoken, right? That's the main thing. And then when they're outspoken, they're going to reject out a little more out in an outspoken way. Where introverts probably going to be a little bit more quiet about it, right? They're going to go, okay, moving on, right? So as you become more educated about community and you start to become more exposed, you're starting to also then see this picture get clearer and clearer, right? As we said before, and then you may still in school, you may begin to date. Now this one's interesting because this one can really be activity based or maybe romance based or both. I mean, it could be both. But again, introvert, extrovert, just depends. But it may be that you really lean into relationships within the activity. So if you're playing on teams, you're building your friend groups and camaraderie and all of that, right? Or romance, maybe dating, beginning to date, right? Now, interesting thing about here is that this is where, this right here is where it gets interesting, because now you're so much more clear on what is going on. When I say clear, we're never perfect, right? But we're a lot more clear about all of your history at this point than you've ever been. But you're also, remember, we were young, right? You can't wait to get away from all this mess, right? You're like, okay, yeah, that was good. Experience that. This wasn't good. That wasn't good. But you know what? Moving on, But if you're the type of person that accepted it, then you probably leaned in. Now, relationships, romance-wise, remember, all of this now with relationship is based on what? All of your interactions, right? To include your draft team. If your draft team, there was healthy relationships, not just, obviously romance, but friends, family, and locale. And then as your circle of awareness about, all the way up through community starts to grow and intensify, and details start to fill in, your romantic relationships are informed by these experiences, okay? So if you had healthy experiences, we're a mix, folks. There's variability. But if you had, let's just say you had a mix, well, then you're probably going to have, growing up, you might have dated, a few different people, or maybe you married your high school sweetheart. Who knows? But whatever it is, the conflicts, right? This is where we also start to first start to get into conflict, right? Conflicts, and we don't piece it together because we're not seeing it from this visual perspective, but that we're dealing with it. This is the first time we're dealing with another human, right? Well, I'll say the first time because you also have relationships along the journey, right? With your little buddies and stuff like that. But this is really the first time as you start to get a little bit older where you're starting to see where somebody else, their experience is different, right? Because their opinions. They may have, what if they're just, maybe there's massive haterade in their family, right? and they're a massive hater about a group or this, there's some extreme that wasn't how you were brought up. You were brought up, say, to respect others and blah, blah, blah. Then there's a mismatch, there's misalignment. This is where you start to see where there is an alignment, and it'll start to come out in interesting ways, right? But we never, because we're younger, we don't sit down and map this out, right? And we're not really one to one with looking back and going, oh, well, now we do, when we do find that there is an outlier where the alignment isn't there, it's pretty simple to go, oh yeah, I don't think we're aligned. Good to know you. Bye. And then that occurs, right? But remember, somebody else's threshold may be considerably less than yours, and they may have had just the wiliest upbringing ever, right? And it can happen, and they don't understand. They don't understand why you're not aligned with them, right? I'm using some extremes just to give an example here, but this is what we're experiencing. This is what we can experience in varying degrees, right? Because we're a mix, right? But if somebody has a super wily upbringing, they're not going to understand why somebody maybe broke up with them, right? They're not going to understand that, oh, you figured something out, and you're like, that's probably not healthy. Now I'm going to, hey, good to know you later. And they're not going to know that, right? They're just not going to have a clue about that. So, and this can actually go on deeper into life, but this is where it starts to begin. And as we progress, also these things happen in our activities. Why is that? Because we're in negotiation on teams, right? Hey, do you have my back? I have your back on a team, right? You're playing sports and stuff like that. Different, it doesn't have to be sports, but whatever it is, could be band, whatever. Are you playing the correct notes? Are you on it? Are you off? So you're getting feedback, and there's all these things going on, and there's a little bit of competitiveness in there too, right? So you're getting that competitiveness, and you're seeing where there is and isn't alignment, and you're having to negotiate these things, some things, and you're also figuring it out. Hey, are some of these things little small potatoes, right? Because what may be small potatoes for some person may be a major ism for another, right? Because if they were raised, let's just say somebody's hyper self-righteous, they were raised in a hyper self-righteous home. Oh my gosh, perfection was all that was accepted, right? And remember that guilt. Perfection was all that was expected. So that guilt can go the other way. I use the negative examples, but there can be the hyper righteousness thing going on too. And then that guilt about being perfect, doing everything perfect, don't miss a beat or else, right? That's a difficulty too. That's unhealthy also. And so that rises to the flavor. And now somebody may be, we're not aligned, but it's because they're so hyper, such a hyper righteous state that they can't throw out, they don't understand what's little potatoes, what's, who cares type stuff. It's, minor stuff versus major stuff, right? So you've got to mix. And this is where we're learning about this stuff. Then as we proceed, right? And whether we're actually in school at this point, because a lot of us worked while we were in school, especially in high school and stuff like that. But let's say that beyond that now, you move on either to higher education and training or to work, and that also could be based on what? Could be based right back on lack, enough, or a lot. Because if you didn't have much, then somebody's probably not paying for education, right? And if you had enough, they still may not be paying for education, right? But maybe you do some training, or maybe you have to do a mix and that sort of thing. Or if you have a lot, boom, I'm going to a college. So now, and then of course, it could be a mix too of school and work too, right? So it just depends. And people jump right into these. And so the lack, enough, or a lot. And so now you're taking all of this luggage with you out into the world, right? And further expanding upon what you've already started, right? And it's been quite a lesson to be a human in the development stages, right? But now, as you've moved on, it may be that you're guilted. Maybe you're guilted not to go to college, right? Because you think you're special. I've known people, okay? or these families have guilted them, make them feel bad to want to go to school or to get training or whatever. Do you think you're better than we are? Da, da, da. You just need to go get a job and quit fussing about with education. And some of the isms can also be a hate toward people who are, say, college educated. And then you can have some people who look down their nose who are college educated at somebody who just goes in and does work, right? Who's more of a, say, an artisan and a technician in that sense, right? There's a little bit more on the creative side from that perspective, right? and a go-getter. You know, they see the value of work because they were brought up with a good work ethic, right? So you can have a mix of this too. You can have strong work ethic that goes on to college and a weak work ethic, and you can have a strong work intellect going right into the workforce, or somebody who's weak. And it just depends. We're all a variable mix of all of these things, right? But we can also be guilted into these tracks. So imagine somebody who, you know, whose draft team basically goes, well, if you don't become a doctor, you're not going to be able to take care. You know, I'm using a doctor as an example, just as somebody who's, you know, paid very well as a professional. But if you don't become a doctor, then you're letting your future family down, and you're letting us down too. Oh my gosh! But this person may have wanted to be an artist, or they wanted to go out and, you know, be a firefighter, whatever it is, right? Something else, right? And now they're guilted, right? So their whole track, and this could have been from the start too, folks, and this whole track could have been on different avenues, right? Where somebody also could be guilted into going to school that doesn't want to go to school, right? That doesn't want to be you know, doesn't want to get into a professional trade per se, you know, not right away anyway. I can tell you my example was talking about accept or reject. I didn't ultimately know what I wanted to be. I know that I like to write, and I knew that I was an athlete, right? And was able-bodied, wasn't afraid of hard work, you know, I was curious, but I didn't know what profession I wanted to be. I had no clue what I absolutely wanted to be. And I'm kind of glad, you know, for me, I'm glad because it's the road less traveled for me. And I'm definitely glad that I went down that path, irrespective of the dips, of the valleys and the peaks. The peaks and the valleys are what give flavor to your life, right? And experience. But needless to say, we all go through this, and we're either consciously aware of it, but we're definitely subconsciously carrying all of these things with us, right? The guilts, the biases, the judgments that we've made, right? Some of these things as we become a little bit wiser, we start to reel back. Okay, so we get out into the work world, right? We're doing our thing. And then we get into a professional status, whatever that might be, right? But essentially, there's a sufficiency where, hey, you know, I can, you know, take care of this, I can take care of that. There's a level of sufficiency. But there's one thing that we haven't dealt with in this entire walk through the human being, right? For everything you need to know. And that is, so we can use a color that we can see, during this whole time, did anybody ask you, right? Everything has been a challenge and response. Hey, these are the choices in front of you. What do you want to do? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? What do you think about this? What do you think about that? It's been, the presentation has been a sell the entire way. And what happens is you've never got to explore who you are. You never got to do the deep dive. And that's essentially all the shadow work is, folks. When you hear people say that, yeah, there's the emotional side of you, the spiritual side of you, and your history. And these are the things you dive back into to go, oh, okay, what was I sold and how much did I pay for it, right? What was the education I received? And then also understand, did anybody ever ask you what you wanted, right? Did they ask you what you wanted, or was it all based on, well, you need to do this to survive, or you need to do that because if you don't, you know, we've all done this, you should do it, you know, all that whole, you know, again, it's just a passive aggressive form of guilting someone. Who's asked you? what you wanted to be, who you are, how you feel about things, what are your actual emotions. Because as we go and we get ourselves into this little, hopefully you can see this, into this little triangle of life up here, at a certain point, we built our entire world based upon potentially, misaligned things to us, right? We may have not taken the time, even though we've reflected at different stages to weed out some, big ticket things potentially. There are some relationships, family, friends, community, whatever, who we may still associate with who are bringing, things that aren't aligned with us, right? Professionally, right? There may be professionally, right? As well, that aren't aligned. You may be making a product that you just don't agree with, right? Out of survival, right? Now, it isn't to say there's a pragmatic nature to a system, right? Because that's essentially what we've been, this is all just one system, right? It's a system. And systems are okay, but a system that doesn't see itself, a system that doesn't allow individuals within it to know who they are. Now, after this much time into this video, if you own an organization or you're a leader of an organization, and you have people, right? And look, folks, in America anyway, $5.5 trillion in waste. We're essentially no better than probably 60% effective. And that's leaning into the notion, into the fact also, right? I'm given a serious leeway here. It's a lot less than that because capacity is never submitted, okay? So effectiveness is never truly reported. But based on the waste and all that, we're probably in the 60s range, okay? Well, if you're bringing people on your team, right? Just like we are all people. We all have a history. We all have, the roads that we've traveled. We're all on a journey, but we're all on a collective journey also. So this individual journey, that I've kind of just walked through very generically. Obviously, there's so many other things we could have tossed in here, but this is also a collective journey for us. And your organization is made up of people with history, people who have been guilted, manipulated, right? Who maybe accepted instead of rejected some things. And this is also why knowing your IQ, your emotional quotient, emotional IQ, your moral and your physical IQ, physical quotient. Knowing those things is so important. Why is that? Because these are the things you would be addressing, to see these things within yourself, but then also see that the same thing is going on with your peers. And then as a leader in an organization at any level, to understand that my teams are made up of people who have all this going on too, a variability of emotions and intellect, right? Moral background, right? And they have an external and internal version of it. Now, after this long video, if you're still here, I have an 88-day program, take your entire team to improve your organizational effectiveness. And it's very comprehensive. So if you contact me at the end of the video, you'll see my contact information. I can come in, and this is just one sliver of some things that I go over, okay? And what it does is it helps you to understand, not only individually understand us, but also to understand our peers, to understand those people on our team, to understand our leaders too, because look, folks, if you're on the broader team, this is just as much your leadership. This is just as much your ownership. They have biases that they've, had early on that they've had to deal with, and some of that stuff stuck. And some of them might be in business because of what? Well, we did it, so you better do it too, because you're nothing if you don't have it, that whole game. And if they've been guilted into it, you may have owners of an organization who aren't truly passionate about what they do, what could we conclude from organizations who perform so poorly. Because if they have done the inner work, if they've done the work with their teams, if they've seen their organization as a collective, okay, that there is the collective health that needs to come from our individual improvement and our individual transformations and journeys, then that's how we can best serve our customers, being everybody in our lives. Everybody that our life touches represent our customers. All right, folks, hopefully you get the idea if you're a human being. All right, folks, remember, hit that good green domino 3 to 5 times a day to uplift, motivate, inspire, and just encourage one another. When you do this, not only are you helping to transform culture, but you're transforming your own life. But remember, you can't transform anything on the outside if you're not willing to transform on the inside. It's super important. All right, folks, have a fantastic day. Look forward to seeing you next time. Hit like, share, and subscribe. Until then, take care.